This one is a strange one to say the least. It's creepy, terrifying and tragic. Have you ever seen this movie? This is the scary as heck 2008 movie called The Strangers. I remember going to the cinema to see this armed with a bucket of popcorn and a clean pair of pants. At the start of the movie, a male voice can be heard saying,
"What you are about to see is inspired by true events."
Leave me a wee comment below and tell me what's the scariest movie you've ever seen. Hi folks, my name's Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. Let's just get right into this story and ask what happened at Keddie Cabin. For this story, we're going across to the Golden State of California, to a tiny wee area there called Keddie. Keddie is an area of around 0.6 square miles and it sits inside Plumas County with a current population of around 66 Californians. This story takes place at the start of the best decade ever, the 1980s baby. Let's start in 1980, shall we? Susan, or Sue, Sharp, uprooted from her family home in Connecticut, along with her 5 young children, and moved to California. She had left her husband back in Connecticut because he was a nasty piece of work and was abusive. Well done, Sue. As I said, they relocated to Northern California. Sue's brother lived there, so at least the Sharp family had somewhere to go to. The Sharp family consisted of John, who was 15, Sheila, 14, Tina, aged 12, Ricky, he was 10 years old, and Greg, who was only 5 at the time. She ended up renting a wee cabin in a rural resort called Keddie. Once settled into cabin number 28, it was on the evening of the 11th of April in 1981 that Sue would give permission for her sons Ricky and Greg to have their friend, 12-year-old Justin Smart, stay over for the night. Sheila, the 14-year-old daughter, was across at another family's cabin. They were called the Seabolts. This cabin was not too far away from number 28, where she would spend the night. Meanwhile, John, the oldest son, and his friend Dana Wingate was in downtown Quincy hanging out. They would both return back to the cabin later that night. 7 people remained in the cabin that night. 3 of them would be brutally murdered, and 1 of them would vanish. The next morning, the 12th, Sheila would return home from the Seabolts at around 7 AM. As she opened the door to the property, she was struck by an awful smell and stumbled upon something that can only be described as pure nightmare fuel. Inside the living room, she found the bodies of her mother Sue, her brother John, and his friend Dana. They had been bound with electrical tape and wire. Close to the bodies was a large kitchen knife, a claw hammer, and a steak knife which had been bent at an extreme angle. This was due to the sheer force in which it was used. Blood was splashed across the floor, up the walls and sprayed across the ceiling. It was truly horrific. Sue was found lying on her side in front of the sofa. She was naked from the waist down and was forcibly gagged by her own underwear and a blue bandana. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest and her throat was cut. John also had his throat slashed, whilst Dana was strangled and also suffered multiple head injuries. All 3 of the victims were found to have suffered blunt force trauma to the head, which later would be determined to have been caused by a hammer. Sheila immediately ran out of the cabin and back to the Seabolts where she had just left. She was hysterical naturally. The father of that family, James Seabolt, quickly attended number 28 and whilst looking through a rear window saw young Greg, Rick and their friend Justin in one of the bedrooms there. He later admitted that he had entered through the back door of the cabin to see if anyone was still alive, possibly contaminating crucial evidence. Plumas County sheriffs attended the location and began an investigation. Well, to say it was flawed is an understatement. I mean, we've talked about cases before where the police and investigators failed in their duties. They can't all be super detectives like Sherlock Holmes. So, for a start, the crime scene wasn't properly secured. And remember I said that someone was missing? Well, that someone was 12-year-old Tina Sharp. She was nowhere to be found, but it would take police a silly amount of time to even realise this. Amongst the evidence that the cops did find was a bloody footprint in the front yard, knife marks on the interior walls, and after interviewing Tina and the Seabolts, it was discovered that they never heard any commotion or screams at all. However, another couple that lived nearby described being awoken around 1:30 a.m. by what they would describe as muffled screams, but as they were unable to tell where the strange noises were coming from, they ultimately decided it was nothing and went back to sleep. Cabin 28 showed no signs of forced entry, but being the early 80s in a small community like that, I imagine most folks left their doors unlocked. There was an unidentified fingerprint lifted from the railing which led up to the rear of the cabin. All of the internal lights were switched off, the curtains were closed, and the phone was taken off the hook. A knife was recovered, discarded in a trash can just outside the Keddie General Store, which authorities believed were linked to the murders. One of the bizarre aspects of this case, though, was the wee boys, Greg, Ricky, and Justin. They were found completely unharmed, by the way, but they remained in the next room watching TV the whole time. Some sources say that they were asleep the whole time. In the next room to where their family was being brutally murdered. I mean, even if the screams were only muffled, it was enough that nearby neighbours could hear it, yet it seemed 3 young kids in the adjoining room didn't. Under hypnosis, wee Justin would claim that he did in fact hear strange sounds coming from the living room. He opened the bedroom door to see what was going on and witnessed Sue with 2 other men. He described one of them as having long hair and a moustache, and the other was clean shaven with shorter hair. Both of them wore glasses. According to Justin, John and Dana had entered the cabin and began a heated argument with the 2 men, which subsequently escalated into violence. He would go on to say that young Tina had came into the living area to see what was going on, only to be taken out of the back door by one of the men. The thing is though, if it was an argument that spiralled out of control and got violent, then why were the bodies tied up? A wee while later, Marilyn Smart, who was the mother of young Justin, they lived nearby also, later claimed that she found a jacket covered in blood in her basement which belonged to Tina, which she turned over to the cops. But the funny thing is with that, there is no official record that it even exists. Martin Smart, the husband of Marilyn and stepfather of Justin, would later claim that one of his tools went missing on the night of the murders, that tool being a claw hammer. Naturally, this drew the attention of investigators, and during an interview he had stated that a friend of his was staying with them that same night, a friend by the name of John Bodie. Martin would go on to say that he had only known John for a few weeks after meeting him at the local veterans hospital, where they were both apparently receiving treatment there for PTSD from their involvement in Vietnam. He also said that earlier on in the night in question, he was joined by his wife and Bodie as they were going to the backdoor bar in Keddie. Whilst on the way there, they stopped into Cabin 28 and invited Sue Sharp. Sue had refused to join them and the trio left and went to the bar as planned. Whilst at the bar, Martin was vocal in his complaints about the music being played. He had an argument with the manager about this, and shortly after finishing their drinks they all left the bar and went back home. Once back, Marilyn went straight to bed. Martin, still pissed at his altercation with the manager at the bar, called the boozer to have it out again over the phone. Martin and Bodie then returned to the bar for drinks. Allegedly. What? Marilyn would go on to tell the investigators that the day after the murders, she and Martin had separated. She claimed that he was short-tempered, abusive and violent. After Martin was subjected to a polygraph test and the interviews of John Bodie and Marilyn Smart were complete, the investigators determined that none of them were involved in the murders. Marilyn Smart was further interviewed at a later date, where she would make some interesting revelations. She stated that her husband Martin had a hatred for young John Sharp, and that in the wee hours of the morning after the murders, she had witnessed Martin burning something in their fireplace. It doesn't take a genius to know that this whole investigation was a flustercuck. The Department of Justice and the sheriffs were criticised heavily for the poor investigations and failure to properly address issues concerning Bodie and Martin Smart. A fine example was the fact that during interviews, John Bodie stated that he was a police officer in Chicago for 18 years. The investigators were like, "Oh, yeah? Well, that's cool, no need to look into that." Bodie also lied about the length of time that he was in Keddie by adding 2 weeks to the timeline, and he even claimed that Marilyn Smart was his niece, which was a lie. He also said that Marilyn was awake when he and Martin had returned from the bar the second time, but she stated that she was fast asleep and didn't even recall when they got back. He went on to say that he had never even met Sue Sharp, which of course contradicts Marilyn's statement that the three of them went into number 28 to invite Sue to the bar. Here's a real good one, which only again demonstrates how useless the cops were on this particular case. So during interview, Martin Smart said, and I quote, "Justin might have seen something that night without me detecting him." So he's basically saying that the boy might have seen something, but hey, I never noticed him. And that didn't even raise the cops' eyebrows. A wee thing to note also is that Martin Smart had a best pal. Who? The county sheriff. I'm done. When it was initially thought that Tina had been kidnapped from the scene, this prompted the FBI to get involved. However, the feds quickly backed off when the Department of Justice was like, "Here lads, there's no need for you guys to be here. You can all just go home." 3 years after this gruesome murder, about 100 miles from Keddie, a skull was discovered. A short time later, an anonymous telephone call was made to the police which claimed that the skull was that of young Tina Sharp's. Subsequent searches were carried out in and around the same location, and after recovering more bones, testing would confirm that they did in fact belong to young Tina Sharp. Near to this scene, the investigators also found a pair of Levi jeans, a child's blanket, and a blue nylon child's jacket. In 2004, the cabin at number 28 was torn down, but that wasn't the end of the story. In a 2008 documentary about these murders, Marilyn Smart stated that she was convinced that her husband and John Boody had committed these murders. Martin Smart died in 2000, and not long after this, his therapist reported to the Plymouth County Sheriffs that Smart had confessed to him that he had killed Sue Sharp because he believed that she was trying to convince Marilyn to leave him. John Boody died in 1988. In an article by the Sacramento Bee back in 2016, it said that a short time after the murders, Martin Smart left Keddie and travelled to Reno in Nevada. From there, he would send a letter back to his wife which stated, "I've paid the price of your love, now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives." Case closed. I mean, all evidence points to Martin. Heck, he even admitted it twice. Well, case not closed. See, in April 2018, new evidence would come to light. DNA evidence found on the tape used to bind the victims linked to another suspect. Investigators said that the DNA links to a known living suspect, and well, Martin Smart and John Boody are both pushing up daisies. At the time of me making this video, they still have not released any information in this regard. That's it for today, folks. Yet again, I sincerely thank you for watching this, and indeed any of my other videos. Please stay safe out there, and as always, keep smiling.